Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Discovery Roundtable, the episode-by-episode discussion show covering Star Trek Discovery from the perspective of Stowe players and Foundry authors. I'm your host, Drogan1701, and with me is my co-host and technical guru, Greendragoon.
Greetings.
And we didn't have time to secure a new guest for tonight, due to a shortened timetable and the amount of time it took to produce the first episode. But we do have back with us someone we thought we wouldn't have back because he thought he was not going to have CBS All Access for as long as he will have it. So please welcome back Duncan Idaho.
I'm the cat wrangler, or the kitty wrangler.
In real life, too, so hopefully we will not hear too much of your cat over the radio here.
Oh, well, she was just making noise, trying to settle her down.
Well, I didn't hear it, so it's all good.
Yeah, about the same temperament as the other thing. It's just not the same scale, so doesn't, kill people.
Well, I always, like to relate things back to Star Trek, and, cats are canon because Data had one.
Yeah, cats still exist in the 24th century. So,
and it wasn't even like a replicated cat or something crazy like that. It was a real cat.
Oh, that'd be funny if you could just dial up a cat in the replicator. It's just like, I want a cat today. Yay! I want another cat. Yay! And that would always produce too many cats.
Yes.
Where's that episode where the Enterprise is overrun with cats?
Closest thing we got is Trouble with Tribbles.
And that's
how it starts.
So speaking of tribbles, there was a tribble in the episode that we're going to be discussing tonight, which was Discovery Episode 3, Context is for Kings.
I love that title.
Yeah.
After the fact, I love the title. It was one of those things where you just don't really kind of get it at the first glance, but when you actually hear it in context, it's like, I think that is the most Trek line, or sort of stereotypically Trek line, that we've heard so far, because it's the Fed perspective finally showing up.
But it's
weirdest
all
way.
And it's all in the delivery too.
Yeah, and it's the context.
Isaacs, who's fantastic with delivery.
And the context of that scene too is just like, I find like you kind of think you get the Discovery from the last episodes, but it really doesn't mean the same thing until you see this one. And I think it's very apt that I think one of the writers described Episode 3 as the actual pilot for Discovery, for what it's going to be about, what the characters are, sort of getting the gist of what the show is. And Episodes 1 and 2 are a prologue. So it's a very different way of doing the show. So it's very impressive.
Mm-hmm. Let's do a quick recap of Context is for Kings. I kind of realized that the episode was in like maybe 3 parts. You had the initial bit where Burnham, who is, it's 6 months later, she's in prison. She's being sent to ostensibly a new prison work site with some other cons, and there's an accident on the shuttle. So I want to know if that pilot lived. For one thing.
Know. I'm still wondering that. I was
never revisited.
I like, if no one brings that up, I'm bringing that up on a future, like trying to get that into another few after Trek.
Yeah.
Just because I want to know what happened to that pilot. I think he's okay because Discovery was right
They
there.
had the suit, yeah.
And
they would have picked him up.
Yeah.
And then the shuttle left, and I don't think like Lorca would have been willing to give up one of his own officers just to send a shuttle on its way.
Yeah, probably not.
So I assume this shuttle guy lived, but I'm so worried.
But in any case, it was all a bit of a sham to basically get Burnham onto the Discovery by Lorca, as we find out at the end of the episode.
Yeah, and God, Lorca in this episode, like, there's a lot of great characters, but for me, Lorca is special.
Mm-hmm. He's so shady, but also cool, and he's like a little bit Colonel Kurtz, but not that, not that far gone.
Yeah. What I really like about Lorca is people describe him as he'll use anyone. He'll manipulate. The thing is, he actually doesn't do it that well. Like, it almost feels unnatural for him to do so, but he has to do it out of necessity for what his aims are.
He's all about the mission.
And it seems like he's got really good reasons for it. A lot of great perspective, seeing that there's something bigger after the war that could be a new horizon. And it's very optimistic. And it's funny is that he's the first real optimistic character that we've seen in the entire show. And the character's on sort of that knife edge of almost being a like Captain Jellicoe type figure of that stereotypical rogue captain, rogue admiral. But there's such complexity there and such depth. And what's behind it is sort of the first feeling of the really optimistic Trek that deals with problems and faces them. But it's coming from such a different type of character.
It's I don't know how they've done it, but they've created a dark optimist.
Yes, and I love it.
Well, I mean, all they did was just give the character depth and complexity. He's not entirely... I mean, not all of him is like this good, happy, fluffy, but at the same time, he's not also... Neither is he meant to be a bad guy.
Yeah, and as you see from his introduction, he's got a lot of stuff which reflects on his character, just the fact that he is interested in the galaxy, interested in the universe. He's got a single tribble, quote, one tribble. Not a bunch of tribbles, he's got one. How does that work?
Don't feed it.
Next to the bowl of fortune cookies.
Yeah, he's got the fortune cookies, which is again another just weird affectation, which sort of adds a lot to character. Later on in the show, he's got the Gorn skeleton. That's picked up a little bit, even though the Gorn haven't been encountered yet. So how did he, in particular, get a Gorn skeleton?
They may not know it's a Gorn.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they haven't made contact with the species yet, but he possesses this item. And it's such a rich thing for the character that it sort of says a lot about him, about how he's venturing out beyond what we sort of think of in terms of conventional behavior, I don't say morality, because he does seem very centered. But there's a lot more to him, and we're only scratching a little bit of the surface. He's already on the next step. That's what it kind of feels like. He's already thinking about what else is out there.
I will say that the story plays up his, I'm going to call it potential immorality for dramatic effect.
Oh, yeah.
But
so
I mean, at the same
think
time,
that he's doing something nefarious here, or at least against Federation principles. In order to win the war, the ends justify the means. It starts off with a little bit of I'm like, there's some Manhattan Project stuff going on here.
Yeah, and that was my the theory that I was talking about last week for what was going on in Discovery. It was so close. I mean, it was up until the very end of the episode where I was able to finally write it off. But it was basically, it was kind of pretty well telegraphed that there was a Manhattan Project style thing going on in Discovery. What I was thinking about was that it was going to be Genesis, or a protomatter bomb that they would eventually turn into Genesis. But they've got a similar type arc going on with a, something we can get into a little bit later after we go through the main character introductions.
Yeah. So, I could see where maybe you were going with that. When in Star Trek 3, when they're talking about Genesis and how he used protomatter, it was obvious that protomatter was a known thing before Genesis.
And that's where I was thinking that they would discover that Genesis has other properties. And that, like the scene of Burnham walking into the fungal room, I thought that was her walking into a
first grow protomatter.
Well, actually, the first results from something that was a Genesis type effect.
Oh yeah,
and that was where I was really being cautious because Star Trek Online's been doing a protomatter plot for a long time. So I was thinking, like, wait, did someone at CBS?
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking is that someone at CBS maybe could have slipped something to Cryptic saying we're working on something with protomatter for Discovery. We think it'd be cool if Star Trek Online also did a protomatter plot that we can build together later. And my thought was that Cryptic was very carefully delaying the culmination of their protomatter base plot to coincide with Discovery launching, because we still are going into stuff on that. But anyway, though, this is completely irrelevant to Discovery because that's not what's going on.
That's not what's going on.
But it's interesting that it was almost something that could have also fit, but they chose to do something that specifically wasn't a reference to the Wrath of Khan, which I love. They're doing something.
Nice. I don't want them to reference like too much, because that's where I think something like Star Trek Into Darkness got itself into trouble. It was trying to reference too many things that had happened, in the Prime timeline.
Yeah,
whereas this, it could fall into the trap of referencing too many things that have gone on in like TOS, and not be its own thing. Yeah, but I don't think they're going that way. So
no, there's really careful Easter eggs, and it's subtle, and it's really easy not to notice it and just assume it's part of the natural background. So I'm in awe of how careful they have been in developing the show, pacing it out, going from scene to scene. Episode 3 might be, even though ostensibly it's really not my cup of tea when it comes to genre sci-fi like the Aliens plot. But I love the episode so much because it's so well written.
Well, I would say that the Aliens plot is really just one scene.
Oh, yeah. And
unlike the trailers, which made it out to be like the thing.
Like that was the whole episode, yeah.
But even
that's what I'm talking about with the 3 different sections. So you had the first section with Burnham and her arrival on Discovery and her trying to figure out what's going on. The second section is she is sent with an away team to the sister ship of the Discovery, which is the Glenn.
Yep.
And as you were alluding to before the show, they are both. Tell me the class name again.
They're both Crossfield class.
Crossfield class, which, as I found out today, is a reference to the first person to go Mach 2 in a jet fight, in a jet. And so we have this, aliens style sequence of them running around the halls, and there's a creature there, and they're trying to figure out what went wrong on the Glenn because it's doing the same experiments that the Discovery is doing. They were just maybe a little further along, maybe pushing the boundaries and clearly pushing the boundaries too much of safety.
Yeah.
And got into some really gruesome consequences.
That was the one part of the episode I didn't like. That was a little too graphic, almost on the sense of conspiracy in TNG. And I was just like, the thing is, though, is that in context, it does make a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And I'm not able to really fault the episode for it. It's just I hope this is kind of it when it comes to that type of thing. Because it sort of set up the stakes for Discovery of this is how dangerous it is to do what you guys are doing. So it did really feed into what Discovery's pretty much going to be doing, which is continuing those same experiments. But I just hope that it's not setting the style, but it's using something that's exceptional for effect.
That we've seen on previous Star Treks where they've been doing, experiments gone wrong, that kind of plot line. And sometimes we see the consequences of it, but they have never been this graphic before. And it's hard to say whether if they had the budget that Discovery has, and if they had the rating that Discovery has, and the format, whether the previous Treks would have gone this far.
TNG went that far.
Well, TNG did the one time for sure. Yeah. And you notice they never did it again.
Yeah.
except,
and that's where
maybe like once or twice. There was that bit with the ensign that was ended up stuck in the floor.
Yeah.
That was a little shocking. There wasn't any blood, but there was a little, woo.
What about the Sparkly Spider episode?
Yeah. That traumatized me as a kid, I can tell you that.
Yeah, but I think it was just that I think they were pushing it a little too far with that, and certainly they could have done it in different ways that weren't quite so horrifying, but at the same time, it's a horrifying reaction, but it does directly serve the story.
It does.
It basically gives you the consequences of failure.
Yeah, so now what they're going to try, we kind of know how that's going to go. So I see the reaction. I just hope that this is, again, this isn't going to be a long-running thing of making it this graphic.
And it may not be. I think they indicated before the show started that they weren't really going to go overboard with that stuff.
Yeah. So
it's not Game of Thrones, and
they were going to
not Spartacus. So
they said they were going to kind of try to keep it down into the PG-13 rating.
Yeah, and I think it showed their attitude because they weren't graphic with the monster though. So it's just like, I grab people in shadows and okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's where it's just, I was just going to say for the aliens thing, I'm not a fan of aliens, and that's just sort of like, there's a monster on board the ship, run! Because for me, I just don't have a good reaction to that. But I think this one was so well done that the graphic side aside,
and it wasn't overdone.
It wasn't overdone, and I still liked it, though. That's the thing, is that I don't like the genre, but I liked the scene. That was the weird thing. So it's just like, okay, yeah, I'm totally down with that.
That tells you it's pretty well done.
Yeah, and it's, it's slick, smooth, well-paced, not drawn out, and it's just like, it was, I think in total, like maybe a sixth of the episode in total. Like if you just count from like when they start off to when they sort of get out, and they didn't protract it, they didn't belabor it. It was, like all things in this episode, it was very well proportioned for what it was doing with the characters, what it was doing with the action, and just like, I liked it.
Yeah, and so far this is...
Yeah.
I'll say, so far, the show is definitely seemed to walk the line as like, look, we're kind of pushing the boundaries here, but we know there's an edge there, and we're not going to cross the edge.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely walking closer than any other Star Trek has.
Yeah.
But
I think that's good. I think that's something it needed to do. I didn't want it to be more of the same.
And yeah, I was a little disappointed last time about like some of the characters being a little not having those sort of the funny moments, but I think I'm really liking Discovery for what it is. Even though we had more of that. It's different, but for me it's almost feeling like this is what it should be now.
Now that we've got a chance to really sink our teeth more into the characters themselves.
Yeah, and this type of story they've got going.
And even this one, I mean, it introduced us to a whole bunch of new characters, so we didn't even have I mean, we're going to have more of that, where people stop being introduced and they can just be people.
Oh yeah, because we've got Saru back, we've got the project science leader Stamets, we've got a theoretical engineer named Tilly, and we've got a security officer named What's Her Face. Landry, that's right.
Yes.
So
seems like an appropriate name for a security officer.
I really liked her character, and it's funny because I did not like her character on Battlestar Galactica, but that's maybe just due to writing. I I said this on Twitter today, and I actually got a like from the actress Rekha Sharma. I really liked the little moment where she stops her officer from breaking up the fight between Burnham and the convicts. It's a way of using character actions to set up the setting and describe the setting. I likened it to it's Han Solo shooting first. It establishes this universe as something that's a little bit more rough and tumble. These people, they're not the straight up, always perfect Starfleet officers that maybe we're used to.
Yeah. And that just fits with where the Federation is now, where the Klingon Empire is now, and it feels so appropriate in every way.
There's a good progression from these people to TOS to TNG to et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and we see seeds of what would later become is sort of the typical Starfleet officer and all these characters. Mm-hmm. Stamets has depth and he's got actual emotion, and that shows with how he takes the loss of the sister ship, because a very dear friend and colleague was on that ship. And he even had a discussion with that character earlier about, no, you guys are pushing things too far. And that was just a great way of setting up what the projects were doing, and just even setting up the USS Glenn in such a way that it's like, we understand why it had its accident. And it didn't really take much. So it felt like a very organic part of the story. It wasn't just like, oh, now this thing happened. It's like, oh, it was actually set up that they might have something like this happen, and it did.
And set up in a way where it wasn't really telegraphed to you. It was, it felt sort of organic.
Yeah, and
you overhear part of a conversation, and you do get the gist of it, that these guys are pushing it a little bit, and because one of your characters thinks so.
Yeah,
and so it's not overly surprising when something bad happened.
And I do like it for Discovery that it wasn't the most successful of the two ships so far. That Discovery's already a little bit of an underdog because it wasn't the lead of these two ships. The other one was making a lot more progress on their experiment. So Discovery now has to play a little bit of catch up in the next episode, but at the same time do a better job of it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's pretty good stakes just in the basics for the next episode.
So then there's the third part of the episode, which is the reveal of what's going on, which I was a little surprised that they actually revealed it this quickly. Which makes me think there's more reveals to come.
Yeah, because there's definitely going to be an explanation of why this technology doesn't stick around. But what was, for me, it was remarkable in this scene is that I went into this scene. So the scene is basically they come back to the Discovery after the mission to the Glen, all but one redshirt make it back safely. Burnham is offered a place. She was a convict that was basically brought on, as Stamets described, as a temp to work on the science project. Lorca then, very happily and conveniently offers her a position on the Discovery. And kind of he's trying his best to make it seem natural, but it so isn't. And this is where he's trying to manipulate the scene, but he's not very good at it. That's what I really like about it. Is that he's got the sort of the superficial aspect of being the great tactician when it comes to people, but he can only go so far. So anyway, he offers the position, and then Burnham turns around saying, okay, I know something's shady going on here. I think you guys are trying to develop, or she says, I know you're trying to develop basically a fungal-based weapon, and I'm not going to have any part of it. And I believed her through the first part of that. And I was actually really pissed at Discovery. It's like, oh, come on, guys. Because you think Lorca is just going to say, yeah, and you're going to work on it. But he says, that's not what's going on. And he shows her the project. And it is so much more hopeful and optimistic. Because it's a new propulsion system based on basically multi-dimensional fungal spores and fungal hyphae that are crisscrossing the universe. It's a sort of it sort of opens up the horizon on Star Trek because it just says the galaxy is alive, and there's an entire ecosystem that we don't know about, or we know very little about, but we know it can go faster. It can be anywhere instantaneously, and we can harness that as a propulsion system.
So I'm really glad that they introduced this sort of high sci-fi concept. Because I was a little concerned that they weren't going to do that it was all going to be sort of geopolitical stuff, which I like, but, Star Trek is also about the sci-fi concepts and that sort of thing. I always stop people, or I want to stop people when they say Star Trek is about such and such, because it's about like a million different things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And one of them is, the big sort of, interesting sci-fi stuff. And so I'm glad they're doing that.
And this struck me as very new and very hopeful, too, because the application for the war is that, hey, we can get a new propulsion system. That gives us a tactical advantage.
Mm-hmm.
But then the B-side is we can go anywhere. And that's where Lorca, apparently, he says right now that this is what he wants, is that he has to win the war because this has to be our new horizon. Because think of the possibilities, and he shows Burnham those possibilities with a personal sort of, at the very least, it's an imaging chamber for where these spores can go.
Yeah.
If not just a personal transportation device.
Which was very interesting because we saw a couple of different things, one of which looked very much like the Preserver obelisk that we have in Star Trek Online, which I think is actually based on something from TOS.
Yeah, it's from the TOS episode, The Paradise Syndrome?
Yeah.
And I think it was very interesting with the choice of planets because Lorca mentions Romulus. Like, he's just been there, even though they haven't made contact with the Romulans, reestablished contact with the Romulans at this point. So it's again opening up the fact that Lorca has different horizons than other characters do in this time. He's already thinking ahead and thinking about what else is out there. And I think there might be a very good reason why he can do that, which is sadly introduced in the original reveal of that character. So
I'm going to relate this back to Star Trek Online here and have this as a really good episode for Foundry authors to watch for a couple of reasons. First is sort of the structure and pacing. It moves along very quickly. It doesn't necessarily linger on any one thing. And pacing is always very good. It has a good action sequence. Actually, a couple of good action sequences with the sort of abbreviated fight, where we learn that Michael Burnham has some good martial arts skills, Vulcan martial arts skills, as well. And then it has the chase and the great sequence with her in the Jeffries tubes, which brought to my mind for probably the first time since ever, and I've watched like every Star Trek episode there is, how much of a pain in the butt it must be to crawl through those Jeffrey tubes. Especially if you're trying to go fast.
Yeah.
Which she was. And I love that little, she starts quoting Alice in Wonderland to herself as like a focusing element of, don't focus on the big giant thing that's coming to eat you from behind.
Yeah.
just go fast. Just
Although
keep going.
I don't know if the tardigrade was eating people. I think it was just angry. Because it's another question of where that giant monster came from. Oh, not giant, but where the space monster came from.
Well, we're going to find out because Lorca kept the space monster.
Kept the kitty. Just another great moment with Lorca at the end. It's like it sort of refocuses that he's got, after his, powerful, this is something, a powerful moment for describing what the future could be. He then goes, just has that dark depth again. Yeah.
It's like suddenly we think, oh, this guy's actually a good guy. And then there's somebody, oh, no, maybe he is shifty like we thought before and a good guy. I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I think he's complicated, and I think he's meant to be complicated. And really, it's a much more
that's a good thing.
Realistic storytelling than just your good guy is good and always good, and there's nothing bad about him, and your bad guy is in the reverse.
I hope Lorca makes it, although I think they could also work the other way and have that be really powerful for an arc. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to Lorca.
I'm agreeing with you there. I still think, having Lorca and Burnham as like a dynamic duo would be just fantastic.
Yeah.
For a long term. So the other thing I was going to have this as a good example for Foundry authors is the way the dialogue works. It's something that I've talked about on our main show sometimes, is that in Star Trek, in a lot of the installments of Star Trek, there's a very sort of deliberate style of speaking that is really not, I think, as relatable to modern people like us. And, fundamentally, Star Trek is made for a modern audience, and I think these people in Discovery, they speak like real people of today. And that's, probably maybe not realistic to what people 200 years from now will talk like, but it's infinitely more relatable to us today.
Yeah.
I think just the choice of language and sentence construction and all of that is very much realistic to today. And I always use Stargate as an example of, like Stargate SG-1 as a way of, those people talk like real people. They didn't talk like the people on Star Trek. And this is more of that style than it is of the style of most of the previous Treks.
How does it compare to Enterprise?
It's closer to Enterprise because Enterprise, of course, is meant to be closer to us today. I think it's closer to Enterprise than it is to TOS, which is interesting because, of course, chronologically, it's closer to TOS than it is to Enterprise.
I was watching TOS the other day, and it didn't actually feel that out of place. I think it's a little bit more of like...
Well, what I'm thinking
about doesn't have the
mostly
same
is that
idiots.
TNG era.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely TNG, DS9, Voyager.
They had this style of writing dialogue. And, of course, we had this like 18-year stretch where Star Trek was essentially being made by the same people.
Yeah.
You had 3 different shows and about 4 movies that were all basically made by the same people and made in the same manner by and large. So, now we're out of that era. So, it's, you got different people writing it. You got different directors, except, of course, we're going to get Frakes at some point here. I don't know what number episode he has, but we're going to get a Frakes episode at some point. So I think that accounts for the differences in dialogue, because you have different people who bring different things to the table as far as behind the scenes goes.
Yeah, and I don't think it's very jarring either, because it's still very, very thoughtful dialogue too.
And it feels very natural.
Yeah, it feels natural. It feels like it just fits. So, for me, I actually wasn't paying too close attention to that, but yeah, definitely, it is very much not necessarily of the moment, but there's a lot more human reflection in there. So you get a lot more subtlety in body language, intonation, and just expressions used. That a lot more is conveyed in relatively little. So it does feel, I'd say, less stilted than TNG, where they might use exposition a little bit more for how they're feeling and what their current state of mind is. And using very verbose language to do so, too.
The person who felt the most like sort of the TNG era Trek style of speaking is Saru. Or Saru, however you pronounce that.
Who is an alien,
Who's an alien, and...
it fits his personality. He's very careful like that. So, and Saru has some great moments in this one, and they're not what I fully expected, because he is still very worried about Burnham, and he definitely hasn't forgiven her for what she's done. He accepts kind of the reality of the situation, but to him, Burnham is still a problem. But at the same time, there's still that sort of a little bit of warmth and motion there. So it's not just him plotting against Burnham. It's him just being Saru. So you get to see that a little bit more.
And, there were some good moments of humor in this episode.
The Klingon.
The Klingon shoot. That was brilliant.
Oh, man.
And I almost wish he had lived.
Oh, no. That wouldn't
It wouldn't have been as funny if he had lived.
No, it wouldn't have been near as funny. But I almost wish he had lived.
Complicated.
And it's kind of weird because it's like right in the middle of like the darkest part of the episode. It's in the middle of the horror scene.
And
it's almost not a laugh out loud moment. It's either you just look at you just cock your head and look at the screen. It's like, what?
I think it's exactly what that scene needed. I don't think that section would have worked anywhere near as well if it didn't have that, because it very precisely gave it the levity it needed to not just be horrifying.
Yeah.
It just sort of brought us out of that, and just we're sort of like, oh, we're back in the universe. There's happiness, or there's not happiness, but there is a light side to
there's some absurdity.
Yes. And I just love the fact that it was the Klingon doing that too, so it kind of brought the Klingons back into a little bit more, made them a little bit more relatable too.
Mm-hmm.
I would say also that the Burnham quoting Alice in Wonderland is also kind of helps with that, because it is a very serious scene, and then you see her like scrambling through Jeffrey's tubes, quoting this book. And almost kind of, it's like, the calming effect in the scene. It's she's keeping herself calm by quoting it. She's occupying her mind.
It is a reference to the original to the animated series. There's something about Spock tells that his mom used to read that to him, or had it in their house, or something like that. It's a reference back to that.
Yeah.
Which is great. They're going for the really obscure stuff.
I would say also the opening scene with Burnham in the shuttle is also, in of itself, just a bit of a comedic effect, because you have she's basically, when the pilot goes to deal with these spores, and she's basically describing what will happen if they're not dealt with, and then you're just watching like the whole scene like fall apart, and the pilot go flying, and they're all chained down, and she's like sitting there describing it while it's all falling apart. And
it's great for a character to be that resigned too, that she doesn't react, and it's just everything about that is great, except I want to know what happened to the pilot.
Pilot's probably fine.
At least it's a scene that does give us a great reveal of the Discovery too. Of course, another thing I tweeted out today is that I figured out why Discovery has the gaps in the saucer. It's so the camera can go through them.
Oh yeah.
What was it? There was a YouTube video that basically sat down and explained it's probably most likely so there's more surface area with windows.
Or it could have something to
like that wouldn't have a very good view though.
Is the crossfield specifically designed for their science project?
It could be.
I don't know. I mean,
but Saru did say that it was designed so that it could do a lot of science projects at once. So I think maybe it was something that was, I mean, because it takes a long time to design and build a ship. So
yeah,
I think it was maybe something that was on the books and was set to be completed right as the war started, and so they maybe retrofitted it to do this.
Yeah, and it probably didn't take that.
The prisoners did seem really surprised that this was a new science vessel, that Starfleet had bothered to finish this.
Oh, it was. It wasn't that it was just new. It was that it was new and not at the front lines.
Okay.
That was the comment. And I will say that I did really appreciate that the one of the prisoners, because it is oh dang it, the main character from Deus Ex Human Revolution, Adam Jensen. So that voice actor, and he's doing the same voice. So that was a great. For me, that was a very
a couple of those guys were recognizable. I couldn't quite place them, but they seemed very familiar.
But it was great to see the prisoners too, because that just brought it down for what the Federation was at this time. It wasn't really that much. It's not that enlightened. I mean, it's got a lot of the same problems, and it's not really dealing with them well.
The prison that they're experiencing is not exactly what Tom Paris experienced.
No, it feels a little bit more Ruapente style. Not quite as bad, but just kind of in that sense of the Federation isn't in the same place it was, and it factors through everything. But now we see, hey, there is a progression possible.
There were two things that didn't happen in this episode that I thought we might get. One is flashbacks. Didn't have any more flashbacks. I'm still thinking that maybe those will be coming, because it was important to establish the Discovery and its crew and get Burnham situated. That was important to do without interruption. And then the other one was getting back to the Klingons.
I was really surprised by that. I was really expecting like flashes to the Klingons, like meanwhile in the Empire.
Yes.
But
no, we really stick with Burnham for pretty much the whole show, except for maybe like one scene.
Yeah, and I really, really, really like that. I mean, it made the episode feel really strong, impactful, and it's like, okay, we need to establish a few things. It wasn't like taking its time of like, we might get to some character stuff later. It's like, nope. This needs to be taken care of now because this is the series.
So, one of the things that about these serialized shows that I've noticed is a lot of them will cut back and forth between different characters a lot during the episode. And it will follow different characters. Like Game of Thrones, you'll follow like 6 different plot lines with 18 different characters throughout one show. And they'll only have a little bit of screen time for each character. This one doesn't seem to be taking that approach.
And it feels like it lets we know things are developing behind the scenes with how the war is going, how the Klingons are faring, how the Federation's faring. And it's comfortable just letting that mystery sit for a little while it sort of sets other things up. So I really like the style of giving it a little more focus.
And that's another thing that we can relate back to Foundry missions, because, of course, as we know on Foundry missions, the player has to be the main character because it's all happening to the player. and that can be a difficult thing sometimes because we all want to create our own characters and that sort of thing. And this is a really good way of showing how you can focus on the main character, but weave the secondary characters in and around them.
Yeah. And it's, that's actually the type of mission I try to create, especially with the more casual dialogue style. And I'm just still really in awe of what they've done here, even though for me, I've been trying to perfect that as a Foundry style for a while. And it's like, I can take that further from what Discovery is doing. Because for me, it feels like it's really pushing boundaries on sci-fi storytelling in very subtle ways, in very thoughtful ways of it's just showing like you can put a lot of thought into how you're pacing things, how you're developing things, and what you're letting the audience think at the time, and then flipping that around to get a great reaction. Because I watched the episode, like immediately once episode 3 finished, I started up again. It's like, I got to go through that again. And watching it the second time was such a different experience than the first time, especially with Lorca and knowing what he was sort of about. And you see the seeds of that in very, very subtle ways,
Mm-hmm.
especially his eyes. And I think that's going to become a key thing.
Yeah, the thing about his eyes, I think they're going to revisit that. There's going to be something about that.
I think what he was talking about is like it was a injury from the war effort, which for him is the fungal research, the multidimensional spores.
Well, maybe it is now, and maybe when the war started, he wasn't doing this project.
Well, if you looked at his eyes, he's got the spores in them. That if you look closely,
well, was it that, or was it? I thought maybe it was a reflection from the stars.
I think, and the line though was that it's like he can almost see home from here. I think he was looking home because I think he can do by himself where he can get glimpses of the same view that Burnham got in the transporter. That may have been. So I think, and that's also, I think, how he knew about Burnham. He says, I know you, because I think he's been doing some research, let's say.
Maybe he's able to watch people.
And I think that's where for him...
That's not creepy at all.
And especially for him of not being afraid of the same things, he's got a very different perspective from everyone. And I think this is why he can see more of the universe.
I just hope they don't make him too godlike. You know,
I don't think. I think it's more.
I don't want another the Cisco.
I think it's more like Kwisatz Haderach, and I think like if he survives, he's going to lose his eyes at the end of the season. Because that was the one thing is that he said that if I want to keep my own eyes, this is how it's got to be. He wants to keep them this way, at least for a little while. So,
well, you know, if we're really going with the Paul Atreides metaphor, then yeah, he'll lose his eyes. Spoiler.
Yeah. So yeah,
spoiler
also,
for Children of Dune there.
And I think there's a nice parallel too. Just one last thing on this. He's the opposite of the Klingons in the last episode. T'Kuvma couldn't see where his objective was. T'Kuvma was searching for Kahless. And it's like, where will we find him? I think Discovery will provide an answer, and that might be how they end the war. Of helping the Klingons eventually find what they're looking for, but it's going to take a lot of development to get that point.
Well, you know, how this all ends is definitely, you know...
there's so many ways.
Yeah.
There's just I will say, at
this point.
This, the Spore travel tech did remind me of something we've seen in Star Trek before. The Iconian Gateway.
Can be anywhere at once.
Yeah.
It also reminded me a little bit of, and I've seen this suggestion elsewhere of, you know, maybe this is the precursor to the transwarp drive experiments like the Excelsior had, and like eventually resulted in hyper-evolved salamanders on Voyager.
Possibly. I think what they might find is that there are more complications to what they're doing. So I really don't think this tech is going to stick around, because what I think they'll find is that using this could ruin the galaxies.
It could be that.
Something like that.
If you think about it, I mean, Starfleet history would probably be littered with experimental ships that either didn't work or worked and there was something wrong with them that they really didn't need or didn't want to pursue. And they might take lessons from each one of those failures or successful failures.
Yeah. So at the very least, you could imagine that their experiments in going effectively transwarp with this illustrated some principles that they tried to replicate without fungal spores later on. So the transwarp experiments, even if Discovery doesn't relate those back, you can easily imagine those taking shape from the principles they're learning here for how this fungal, like interconnected, intergalactic fungal community works.
Now, it is something that Star Trek Online could do, which is, you know, to reopen these experiments as a, you know, a featured episode at some point.
Maybe it could be like the Zenkethi are trying to create these fungi by using protomatter on the crystals.
It could be
something like that.
Part of that depends on, you know, where in the development cycle they were let in on all this.
Oh yeah.
If they've been let in at all.
If they've been let in on us, because I know I'm sure to some extent, you know, the Star Trek Online devs are sitting there watching these as we do. So
yeah, and it kind of depends too on like who, like it could be that even if there are secrets coming. It could be that only the higher ups know, and then the people working under them don't necessarily know the full picture until it starts actually taking shape. Although I know on 10 Forward Weekly, Kale mentioned a few months back, like a couple of months ago, when they said they were in talks with CBS. So that might establish
said that a lot.
Yeah. But yeah, it was one of those, like, they stopped going from, like, well, maybe we'd like to much more of a knowing look. After they started saying that we've actually talked to CBS, because they did let that now. So
even as far back as like August, they've been saying that they might have something before the end of the year, and we already got the uniforms. So
yeah, and anything where they say on 10 Forward Weekly could also be a lie,
because Kale doesn't talk about upcoming content.
So
don't ask.
Speaking of need to know, why don't we finish off by talking about the Black Ops elephant in the room? The black badges.
The black badges? Is this Section 31?
I think it's Starfleet intelligence, but it could depend on if there's a mystery for who Lorca is getting his orders from. Because they carefully did not show him receiving orders to go find the receiving his orders to go investigate the Glen. You got the comm screen saying incoming, top secret classified message.
Above top secret.
Yeah. And when he answers it, I mean, we don't see him answering it. So there could be a mystery going on there with who he's getting his orders from. And that could develop into a Section 31 plot.
Of course, the registry is 1031.
I think the writers are aware of the Section 31 in the community to the point where they might use it as a red herring.
Could be. It's been good about subverting our expectations.
Yeah, and I think, too, with just trying to portray Starfleet as darker, I think it would undermine what the show has done so far if they made this a rogue organization. Because then you couldn't say what's going on in Discovery and those characters is representative of the Fed. So there goes the Fed arc out the window, and we just have the prison transport now and miscellaneous stuff on the Shenzhou to really describe what the Fed is at this time. So I don't think, unless it's developed in a completely different way, that this is Section 31, because it would run counter to the show. And describing this as Starfleet versus a rogue cell in Starfleet that you can't really take as representative.
Well, and there could be ties without the whole shit being Section 31, or even Lorca being Section 31.
I mean, even Admiral Ross worked with Section 31.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's one of those things where it's like, it could be as a background thing, but I mean, developing that full research, running two fully crewed research vessels is pretty big. And
it's a little bit the antithesis of what Section 31 is. Yeah,
and especially with how they're portrayed in Enterprise, of making use of very small things and assets. So they had an effect in very subtle ways, and they never ran ships. And I think the black comm badge thing, too, is like, why would they wear those if they were Section 31? If that meant Section 31...
You don't announce your presence if you're Section 31.
Because you could just wear a normal comm badge, and no one's the wiser. You would only wear that if you're basically saying, "Hey, I'm top secret. You don't get to know who I am." That really screams to me more classified military operation,
regular Starfleet intelligence.
Yeah, because it doesn't make any sense if that's Section 31. It's like, wait, you guys are advertising on a starship with like 4-year cadets and research personnel with open comms.
And I've had that problem with any number of Foundry missions, which is, they have somebody walk up to you and declare that they are Section 31. It's like, no, they wouldn't do that. Or, if they did that, they'd wind up, shoved out an airlock 5 days later.
I actually subverted that because of one of my missions. I had a character who was apparently approached by Section 31, and it turned out to be the Undine, using the reputation of Section 31 as a way of introducing themselves and taking advantage of situations. So it wasn't actually Section 31, it was a caricature of Section 31 that did that. So yeah, I think it's like an easy call, and I think that's why the internet's kind of jumping on it right now. And I don't think easy calls work with Discovery.
Yeah.
Because they haven't worked so far. Because I think there's even going to be complexity with what Kitty is.
Well, it seems like it's going to be a subject in the next episode.
It does.
Yeah, and now the Kitty was part of the trailer. But it was funny, it's just like, because it was pointing out that Kitty is a big water bear, tardigrade, which has... It's a very unique ecological role, and it's actually not a predatory life form. It's more of a detritivore. So what it kind of comes down to is the question of, was Kitty on the ship when it had its accident, or did it come on as a result of the accident?
Was it something that got mutated because of the accident?
I'm thinking it could be part of the fungal ecology.
Maybe it feeds on the spores and happened to follow through whatever trail these spores run through.
Because it has claws that can cut through multi-layered art, like hull plating.
Yeah.
This thing isn't normal.
Is not normal. But that's okay. I mean, it's great that there's more reveals and more mystery to come, that they've made a big reveal, but it's not going to be the only one.
Oh, yeah, because, there's a reveal on what the throwaway monster was in the third episode. It really kind of feels like after you sort of watch it and after you kind of get the idea that there might be something going on to it, it almost makes Kitty feel a lot more sympathetic because it could just be scared. It's just an animal. It's not like it's behaving like an animal that's trapped in this environment. So you don't necessarily just ascribe to it just arbitrary monster motivations like, zombie. You can almost imagine it just being a sympathetic character at some point, even though it killed many people, or a bunch of Klingons.
And one red shirt.
Yeah.
He at least got a name.
Yeah, he got a name, but he wasn't likable, so there we go.
Yeah. So I think that will do it for us for this episode. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care.